When my father passed away, I thought the worst was over. But on the very day I received the keys to the house he left me, my stepfather, Mark, handed me a list of house rules. He claimed the house was rightfully his, citing some cryptic promise my father allegedly made to him years ago. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding, until I found out the shocking truth hidden in the house. So please subscribe to the channel. I'll never forget the day Mark, my stepfather, barged into the living room, waving a stack of papers. "You're not the rightful owner of this house," he said, his voice calm but laced with a smugness I couldn't ignore. I froze. In my hands was my father's will, clearly stating that the house belonged to me. I had read it a dozen times since the lawyer handed it over, and there was no ambiguity. It was mine, but Mark didn't care. "That's not the real will," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Your dad told me years ago that he made another one. I've seen it with my own eyes." At first, I thought it was a bluff, just another desperate attempt to assert control. But the confidence in his tone made me uneasy. Why would he lie about something so specific? "If that's true, where is it?" I asked, holding my ground. He shrugged, a sly grin on his face. "It was here, in the house. Your father must have hidden it somewhere safe. Maybe you just haven't found it yet." I felt a chill run down my spine. Could he be telling the truth? My dad wasn't the type to leave loose ends, but the idea that there might be another will hidden somewhere in the house filled me with dread. What if Mark's claim was real? I spent hours that night going through my father's belongings, drawers, closets, even the attic, but found nothing. Meanwhile, Mark walked around with an infuriating air of superiority, as if he already knew something I didn't. Deep down, I knew I couldn't let it end there. If there was another will, I'd find it. And if there wasn't, I'd have to prove once and for all that Mark was lying. It started small at first. Mark would casually mention that certain rooms in the house weren't safe or needed repairs before locking them up. I didn't think much of it. After all, the house was old and maybe some areas were falling apart. But the more I noticed, the stranger it became. He wasn't just locking one or two rooms, he was sealing off entire sections of the house. And every time I asked about it, he brushed me off with vague answers. "What's going on in there, Mark?" I asked one morning, pointing to the study door. It was locked tight, and the key was nowhere to be found. Mark glanced at me, his face unreadable. "There are things in this house best left undisturbed," he said, his voice calm but eerily final. "What things? Old junk? Family secrets?" He wouldn't say, and that's when my frustration turned into suspicion. One day I caught him coming out of the locked guest room carrying a box. I didn't get a good look at what was inside, but he quickly shoved it back in and locked the door behind him. "Why are you acting like this? What are you hiding?" I confronted him that evening, but he only smirked. "This house has history," he said cryptically. "Some parts of it aren't meant for you to see." I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something important, something tied to my dad. But every time I tried to get near those rooms, Mark seemed to appear out of nowhere, blocking my path. It was as if he was guarding a treasure or a secret too big to let me uncover. Whatever it was, I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him keep me in the dark forever. I didn't expect to find anything when I started going through the old wooden desk in my father's study. It had been locked for years, one of the many rooms Mark had kept off limits. But after finally finding the key hidden under a loose floorboard, I couldn't resist. I figured I'd find some dusty papers, maybe a few old bills or photographs. What I didn't expect were the letters. They were tucked away in a hidden compartment in the bottom drawer. A small stack of yellowed envelopes tied with a faded red ribbon. The handwriting on them was unmistakable. My dad's careful script, addressed to someone named A. At first, I thought it might be an old friend or business partner, but as I read the first letter, my heart sank. "Dearest A," it began, the words heavy with emotion. "I know what we did was wrong, but I couldn't bear to lose you. No one must ever know, not even my family. I hope you'll understand." What had he done? What secret was he hiding? My father wasn't the type to let anything weigh on his conscience. Yet the words in these letters painted a very different picture. The tone of his writing was raw, almost desperate, as though he was trying to justify something he couldn't quite forgive himself for. I read through letter after letter, piecing together fragments of a story I could barely believe. Whoever A was, they weren't just some casual acquaintance. They were tied to my father's life in a way I never could have imagined. When Mark caught me reading them, his face turned pale. He snatched the letters from my hands and said, "Those were never meant for you to see." That only made me more determined. If these letters were tied to the mystery of the house or to Mark's behavior, I wasn't stopping until I uncovered the truth. Mark had always been adamant about one rule. The basement was off limits. He didn't just lock it, he reinforced it with a heavy deadbolt and claimed it was unsafe. Anytime I questioned him, he'd get defensive. "There's nothing down there but dust and trouble," he'd say, but his tone always felt a little too sharp, as if he was trying to scare me off. Of course, the more he insisted I stay out, the more curious I became. What was so dangerous about the basement? What was he hiding? After weeks of wondering, I finally decided I couldn't take it anymore. One night, when Mark was out running errands, I grabbed a hammer and screwdriver and pried the lock open. The air down there was cold and heavy, with a faint, musty smell that hadn't been disturbed in years. The single light bulb flickered as I descended the creaky wooden stairs. At first glance, it looked like just an ordinary basement, old furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly, but something felt off. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind a dusty stack of crates, was a large metal safe. It looked ancient, the kind you'd expect to find in a bank vault. The paint was chipped and the hinges were rusted, but the lock was still intact. I knelt down and ran my fingers over it, feeling a strange mix of excitement and dread. Why was there a safe down here? And why hadn't anyone mentioned it before? My dad had never been the secretive type. At least, that's what I thought. I didn't have the tools to open it that night, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was inside had been hidden for decades, and Mark didn't want me to find it. The mystery of the safe consumed me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers I was looking for were locked away inside. It happened during one of our many arguments about the house. Mark stormed into the living room, clutching something in his hand, and tossed it onto the coffee table. It was a golden pocket watch, pristine despite its age. I recognized it immediately. My father had always kept it in his study, tucked safely in a velvet-lined box. He used to say it was a family heirloom, passed down for generations. "That watch belongs to me," Mark said firmly, his voice leaving no room for debate. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The weight of it felt oddly comforting, a piece of my father I hadn't seen in years. But as I examined it, something caught my eye. The engraving on the back. It read J.K., my father's initials. "What are you talking about?" I asked, holding it up. "This was my dad's. It even has his initials." Mark's expression darkened, but he didn't back down. "Your father gave it to me years ago. He said I could have it because I'd always admired it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. If he gave it to you, why was it still in his study when he passed? Why didn't he mention it in his will? Mark shrugged, his tone dismissive. He probably forgot, or maybe he didn't want to make a big deal about it. Either way, it's mine. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. My father wasn't the kind of man to just give away something so important, let alone forget about it. Something didn't add up. It felt like more than just a dispute over a watch. It was another piece of a bigger puzzle. Why was Mark so desperate to claim something that clearly wasn't his? What else was he hiding? The watch wasn't just an heirloom anymore. It was a clue, and I wasn't about to let it go. It was just after sunset when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Mrs. Bennett, our elderly neighbor, standing on the porch. She lived 2 houses down and had known my father for decades. Her face looked tense, her hands clutching the handle of a wicker basket. "Can I come in?" she asked softly, glancing over her shoulder as if she didn't want to be seen. I nodded and stepped aside, a little confused. Mrs. Bennett wasn't the type to visit unannounced. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. The moment she sat down, she leaned in and said, "Be careful. Your father trusted the wrong person." Her words hit me like a cold gust of wind. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She sighed, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the basket. I wasn't going to say anything, but seeing how things are, I feel like I owe it to your father. Before he passed, he confided in me. He told me he regretted some of his decisions, especially about Mark. That caught my attention. Mark? What about him? Mrs. Bennet hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window. He didn't tell me everything, but he said Mark was pressuring him about the house, the money, everything. Your dad wasn't sure he could trust him, but by then, he was too sick to fight back. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Why didn't you tell me this earlier? I thought it wasn't my place, she said quietly. But after seeing Mark locking up rooms and acting like he owns the place, I knew something wasn't right. Just be careful. There's more going on than you realize. Her words left me shaken. Mrs. Bennet didn't have all the answers, but her warning confirmed my suspicions. Mark wasn't just overstepping, he was hiding something. And whatever it was, I was determined to uncover it. It started with whispers. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Mark had always been a private person, but lately his behavior had become more suspicious. He'd disappear into his room late at night, talking in hushed tones, and the moment he'd see me, he'd hang up or change the subject. One night, unable to sleep, I heard his muffled voice coming from the study. It was odd. He never used the study at night. I tiptoed down the hallway, careful not to make a sound. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear his side of the conversation. I told you, Alicia, I'm working on it, he said, his tone agitated. The money's tied up right now, but I'll get it. Just give me more time. Alicia? The name struck me. I'd never heard him mention anyone by that name before. I leaned closer, holding my breath. This house is the key, he continued. Once I get everything sorted, the debts will be cleared. You just have to trust me. I froze. The house? My house? What did he mean by the key? And what debts was he talking about? Mark's voice softened, almost pleading. I know I've screwed up, but this is my chance to fix everything. Don't do anything drastic, okay? Just wait. At that moment, the floor creaked under my foot. My heart stopped as Mark's voice abruptly cut off. I quickly darted back to my room, my mind racing. Who was Alicia? Why did he owe her money? And what role did the house play in all this? The next morning, Mark acted as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't unhear his words. Every time I asked him about his phone calls, he'd brush it off, claiming it was work stuff or none of my business. But his dismissive attitude only made me more determined to find out the truth. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was bigger than that. Mark was tangled in something messy, and he was using my family's home as a way out. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. One thing was clear. This Alicia knew something, and I wasn't stopping until I figured out who she was. It was a rainy afternoon when I decided to dig through my father's desk. The house felt emptier than usual, and the tension with Mark had reached a boiling point. I'd been trying to find something, anything that could explain his strange behavior. So I started with the desk. My father was meticulous about his paperwork, and his desk was always neatly organized. But as I sifted through old receipts, tax documents, and a pile of letters, I found something that caught my eye. Tucked behind a stack of folders, there was a worn envelope, its edges frayed as if it had been opened and closed many times. The envelope contained a deed to the house, one I had never seen before. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I unfolded the paper, my heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any deed. It was an updated version, signed just a few months before my father passed. My hands trembled as I read through it. The terms were mostly standard, but there was one clause that stood out. It read, "The property is to be held in trust until such time as the primary resident is determined to be incapable of managing the property." I read it again. Primary resident. The phrase felt off. Why would my father include such a clause in a deed that seemed to outline his wishes for the house? It wasn't like him to leave anything unclear, especially something as important as this. The more I thought about it, the more the words began to haunt me. Was this clause meant for someone else? Was it about Mark, or was it referring to me? It hinted at a legal complication I didn't fully understand, but one thing was clear. This deed wasn't the straightforward document I thought it was. I tried to focus on the rest of the details, but my mind kept going back to that clause. If the house was somehow tied up in a trust, if there was a condition for who could manage it, then Mark's claim to it started to make sense. I had to find out what this all meant. I couldn't let Mark manipulate the situation any longer, especially if my father had put conditions in place that I didn't know about. This deed was the key, and I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers without uncovering every detail. The mystery of the house was only getting deeper. It was a tense evening, the kind where the air feels thick with unresolved issues. Mark and I had been circling around each other for weeks, both of us on edge, neither willing to back down. He'd been pushing harder than ever for control over the house, and I had finally had enough. The truth about what was really going on had to come out one way or another. The argument started over the deed, the one I'd found hidden in my father's desk. Mark had been evasive whenever I asked him about it, brushing it off as irrelevant paperwork or old business. But tonight, something in me snapped. "What's really going on, Mark?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Why are you acting like you own everything? This house, the money, the watch, it's not yours and you know it." Mark's face went pale, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. For a moment I thought he'd stay silent again, but then, in a voice quieter than I'd ever heard before, he spoke. "You have no idea what I've had to deal with," he muttered almost to himself. I stepped closer, refusing to back down. "What are you talking about?" He hesitated, then let out a bitter laugh, one that didn't sound anything like him. "You really think your father was perfect, don't you?" I nodded, my stomach tightening. "What does that have to do with anything?" Mark's eyes darkened. "He wasn't. Your father. He made a mistake when he was younger, a big one, and I've been keeping it quiet all these years." It hit me like a slap in the face. "You've been blackmailing him," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. Mark didn't deny it. Instead, he let out a slow, bitter breath. "Yes, I knew about a mistake he made when he was in college, something that could have ruined him. I threatened to expose it unless he agreed to help me out. The house, the money, everything. It was all part of the deal." My mind was reeling. The man I'd known all my life, the man who had married my mother and lived with us all these years, was nothing more than a manipulative opportunist. I felt betrayed, not just by Mark, but by my father, who had allowed this to happen. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked at me, his face hardening. "Because your father made his choice, and so did I. And now, it's too late to turn back." The weight of his confession hit me like a ton of bricks. I knew one thing for sure now. Nothing about this house or Mark was what it seemed. Everything had been building up to this moment. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together, but the answers weren't what I expected. The house, my father's legacy, the family heirlooms, and Mark's strange behavior, they were all connected, and I was getting closer to the truth. After Mark's shocking confession, I couldn't just sit back and let things unfold. I knew something was off, but it wasn't until I found the deed to the house with that strange clause about a trust that I truly started digging. The more I looked into it, the more I realized that everything I thought I knew about ownership was wrong. The house wasn't just my father's, it was tied to a trust, and the conditions for who would inherit it weren't as clear-cut as I'd imagined. I spent hours at the library and later meeting with a lawyer, trying to make sense of the legal language. Slowly, the mystery started unraveling. There was a trust set up decades ago, and the key to unlocking the truth was a document hidden deep within the family files. The trust wasn't just for the house, it involved the entire estate, but the kicker was that it didn't leave the property to Mark or even to me. It gave control to someone else. That's when I learned about her. A distant relative, someone I'd never heard of, had been named as the executor of the trust. Her name was Olivia, and she was the one who had the final say on who truly owned the house. I couldn't believe it. All this time, I thought Mark had been manipulating everything, but the real power rested in Olivia's hands. She wasn't just a distant relative. She was the one who had the legal authority to decide what happened next. And what's worse, I found out that Mark had known about her all along. He tried to keep it hidden, hoping no one would ever discover Olivia's role. But I knew I couldn't back down now. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about uncovering the truth and taking back control of what was rightfully mine. When I finally met Olivia, it felt like the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. She was calm, collected, and sharp. She knew exactly what Mark had been up to, and she was ready to make things right. The house, the estate, everything. It wasn't Mark's to control, it was mine, and with Olivia's help, I was going to take it back. I had finally found the true owner, and it wasn't who I'd expected.